Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sania Farooqui Show. In today's episode, we have with us Sahar Aziz, Professor of Law, Middle East Legal Scholar, and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar at Rutgers University Law School, and founding director of the Center for Security, Race and Rights. We're going to be spending the next couple of minutes discussing Sahar's new book, Racial Muslim, and what it means to be a Muslim in America and even in the rest of the world. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sahar. It is wonderful to have you on the Sania Farooqui Show. And many congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here to speak with you today.
Likewise. So I'm going to start by reading a short description about your book, just to give our audience a little more context. Your book demonstrates how race and religion intersect to create what you call the racial Muslim, comparing discrimination against immigrant Muslims with the prejudicial treatment of Jews, Catholics, Mormons, and African-American Muslims during the 20th century. You explore the gap between America's aspiration for and fulfillment of religious freedom, with America's demographics rapidly changing from a majority white Protestant nation to a multiracial, multi-religious society. Your book is an indispensable read for understanding how the past continues to shape the present to the detriment of America's future. Could you start by telling us a little more about your book and why did you feel it was important to write on this subject?
This is the book that I couldn't find in the libraries as I was researching for evidence to support my advocacy when I was a practicing lawyer before I joined the academy, to try to show that what was happening to Muslims in the US post 9/11 was not merely religious discrimination. It wasn't simply about some kind of theological dispute or some Christian-based only or Muslim-based only disagreement. It was much more about the way in which Muslims were racialized, meaning that their religious identity was imputing on them these biological-like traits that then allowed people to assume, in a way that was completely acceptable in American mainstream society, to assume that Muslims were disloyal, that they were foreign, that they were prone to joining terrorist groups if they weren't already secret members of terrorist groups, and that their religion taught them to be against democracy, against liberalism, against women's rights. And so it didn't really matter whether, in fact, you were a devout Muslim, a non-devout Muslim. It was your identity. It was having a Muslim identity, not even just your religious beliefs, in fact. And so, as a result, Muslim identity was treated similar to the color of your skin when it comes to Black people in America. And that was ultimately what I was trying to prove, because there were certain laws in the US that only protected against racial discrimination. They did not protect against religious discrimination.
And what was the impact of Donald Trump's Muslim ban in 2017 on Muslims living in America? And has that changed now that the Biden administration has lifted it? But what kind of damage did the ban do? And are people still impacted by it?
The Muslim ban was both a blessing and a curse for Muslims in America. It was a blessing because it was the first time since 9/11. So we're talking about January 2017.
Yeah.
16 years had gone by when many of us, including myself and many people in the civil rights community that were Muslim, Arab, South Asian, and their allies in other communities, were very concerned and had plenty of evidence to show that Islamophobia was entrenched in American society, that it wasn't simply backlash after the worst terrorist attack on US soil in 2001, but that it had become this permanent racist system. And nobody seemed to be taking us seriously. The government would claim these were just anomalies, they were accidents, it was a bad apple. The public thought we were whining and complaining and they wouldn't look at the facts. So when Donald Trump issued the Muslim ban after an entire year of campaigning on Islamophobia, I have an article called A Muslim Registry: the precursor to internment ? Which is available online for free. It's a legal argument. It's a legal article that has every single quote that Trump stated while he was campaigning for president, and it was virulently and explicitly anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. So when he issued that ban, that was the evidence that convinced liberals in America that Islamophobia was a very serious social problem. And that's when you saw tens of thousands of people protest in airports across the country. And only a small portion of them were Arab, Muslim, South Asians, whereas the vast majority were white liberals, African-American liberals, Latinx liberals, and other immigrant communities. And so that then was a turning point for really trying to seriously address Islamophobia, identifying it, studying it, and trying to combat it. Now, of course, the curse is that millions of people's lives were harmed to varying degrees, right? From those who were students and had work visas and who essentially were not US citizens, but they were either green card holders or held valid non-immigrant visas who were abroad at the time, couldn't come back into the country. Their families couldn't reunite with them. Many of them had jobs they needed to go to. They were enrolled in college and they couldn't start their semester. There were financial implications because if you were working and you needed the source of income from your job in the US. So it was devastating. And also because it was so sudden. So nobody had a chance to plan. Trump hadn't even told many people in the Department of Homeland Security that he was going to do this because it was issued as an executive order from the White House only 8 days after he became president, and it created a chaotic environment. Now, unfortunately, notwithstanding litigation, plaintiffs suing the Trump administration, arguing that it was unconstitutional and it was in violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Supreme Court ultimately did uphold a narrower version of the ban, which applied only to non-immigrants, so it did not apply to people with green cards, and a subset of non-immigrants from certain countries, almost all of whom were Muslim majority countries. So, and there was a waiver provision, but the waiver provision has rarely been exercised. So you still have people who have been feeling the negative, harmful impacts of it. Now, Biden did, as soon as he came into office, he did repeal it, so the ban no longer applies. But again, we're talking about 3 years of exclusion of a large number of millions of Muslims. And it sent a message to Americans that Muslims are permanently outsiders, that you shouldn't trust them, that we see them as a national security threat. And that has serious implications for Muslims in the US who go to work, who go to school, who go to public spaces, who run for office. They then become victims and targets of Islamophobic smears and accusations that we are not loyal, accusations that we support violence, accusations that we are hateful people and that our religion teaches us to hate, when in fact, if you look at the lives and the principles of the 1.8 billion Muslims across the world, 99% of them support peace. And they want democracy, and they want self-determination, and they want transparency, and they share many of these liberal values that the West claims belongs to it, when in fact, these values are universal, and they in fact don't contradict the majority interpretation of Islam.
I'm going to quote an extract from Time magazine about your book. The racial Muslim proposes an answer that some American politicians and institutions have perpetuated a narrative that Islam is not a religion and thus does not deserve protections. In this view, Islam is instead a political ideology, and Muslims, in reality, worshippers from diverse racial backgrounds, are viewed as racial groups subject to racial discrimination. Could you elaborate a little more on this?
Yes, so effectively, the research question of the book is, why would a country such as the United States that prides itself in protecting religious freedom in the First Amendment of its US Constitution and in many laws that were passed by Congress and in the social norms, the social fabric of the country, Americans believe it's very American to protect religious freedom, and that we're taught that religious pluralism is a good American value. So you have that on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have at least 20 years, and in my book, I show it actually goes back decades because its origins is European Orientalism that was imported into North America by the European settlers who came here. But if you just look at the post 9/11 era, where the evidence is so obvious and so targeted and explicit, how do the 50% of Americans who in poll after poll throughout these 20 years have unfavorable views of Muslims? How do they reconcile that? And by having these unfavorable views of Muslims, the consequence is they then support the state's targeting of Muslims in terms of surveillance and deportation and Muslim bans, and discrimination in prisons, discrimination in schools, because they see them again as outsiders, as others. And so what I argue in the book is that once you realize that many of these Americans, and I'm not saying all Americans, the polls show it's between 40 to 50%. And when you look at the Trump voters, it's at the 70th percentile in terms of people who have unfavorable views of Muslims in America.
Yeah, very interesting. And like you said, your book dives deep into the effects of 9/11, but you also talk about historical roots of Islamophobia, the establishment of Israel, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the first Gulf War, and 9/11, and how all of these factors and events contributed greatly to the stereotypical image of what a Muslim was or is in the eyes of an American. You've spoken a little about it, but what are the biggest challenges for Muslims in America right now?
Well, Muslims are a very tiny minority. Even though they have received so much negative publicity and so much bad media, especially the closer you get to 9/11, and then it went up again when Trump was running on his Islamophobic platform, but they're only 1.5%, if not at most 2% of the population. So you're talking about a low estimate of 4 million and a more probably accurate estimate of 6 million out of a country of more than 350 million people. So one challenge is, how do you counter these stereotypes when you're such a small minority? Also, of those 6 million, it's a very diverse community. 30% are African Americans. 30% are people whose origin is the Middle East and North Africa. 30% is people whose origins is South Asia, right? Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. And then you have 5% who are Latino, and they're actually the highest number of converts in the US right now. And then 5% are what we would call multiracial. And they have very different experience. And then 60 to 65% of the non-African Americans are immigrants. Yeah. So they're new to the country. They don't have social capital. They don't have generational wealth that they've built over time. They don't have high positions necessarily in media and in elected office and in places where decision-making happens, so that they can stop the discrimination and they can counter the negative stereotypes. So that's one challenge. The other challenge they have is that there is a split in how to respond to Islamophobia within the community. And I talk about this in the last chapter. There is one train of thought that says, let's just be as cooperative as possible. Let's do as much interfaith as possible. And let's just try to convince people that we're good people. And this is all just a big misunderstanding. And if only we could counter ignorance with education, then we can stop Islamophobia. Of course, the problem is when you're only 6 million out of 350, there's only so much you can do. The other approach, which is the younger generation's approach, those who were born in America, those who were raised in America, are saying, no, we're not going to apologize for anything. And we're not going to prove anything, because it's unacceptable and it's racist for us to even accept that frame. What we're going to do is ally with African Americans, the Black Lives Matter movement, the immigrant rights movement, the Latino rights movement, the LGBTQ movement, right? We're going to ally ourselves with civil rights movements, and we're going to make this about systemic racism, because it's not Islamophobia by itself. And many of the causes of discrimination against Muslims overlap with the causes of discrimination against Blacks and Latinos and other immigrants and other minorities. So that is going to be a challenge in the future, because again, you're having this generational tension. Finally, the other challenge is when we do come up, when we are slowly rising. I mean, we have many African-American Muslims. Andre Carson is elected to Congress. Keith Ellison was elected to Congress. They were the first Muslims elected to Congress. And now Keith Ellison is the Attorney General of Minnesota, and they're both African-Americans. We also have many African-American Muslims who are judges at state levels and who have accomplished significant things in the US. However, those, particularly those who are from Middle East, North Africa, or South Asia, even when they move up, they still get attacked. So look at Rashida Tlaib, look at Ilhan Omar, the way that they've been so virulently and viciously attacked, and in ways that are completely unacceptable. And being accused of being terrorists, being accused of being anti-Semitic, just because they disagree on US foreign policy in Israel, being accused of not belonging. And so even when they get power, formal power, that doesn't immunize you, right, from Islamophobia, which again is just evidence that it's a deeply entrenched problem. So there's much work to do, but I have a lot of faith in the younger generation of Muslim Americans and their allies of different communities. And I think as America diversifies, its demographic is diversifying quickly, so there will not be a majority race. I think this is also going to change the power dynamics and hopefully cause people to work together more rather than be segregated and fight with each other.
I'm coming to my last question because we are running out of time. I could go on and on and on with you, and it's, your insights are really interesting and very sharp. But my last question, growing Islamophobia in the rest of the world, especially Europe, UK, India, do you think things are going to get worse?
So I'm actually co-editing a book with Dr. John Esposito of Georgetown University right now about this very issue. We had a conference called Global Islamophobia in an Era of Populism, which all the videos are available online with the Center for Security, Race, and Rights. So I encourage your viewers to watch it, csrr.rutgers.edu. And we explore this issue of how does Islamophobia, how is it similar and different transnationally? Because we are seeing it pop up, not just in the US. We see it in Canada, we see it in Western Europe, we see it in Eastern Europe, we see it in China, in India, in Myanmar. And I think that unfortunately, it's going to continue to be a problem for multiple reasons. One reason is that the global war on terror that was spearheaded by the United States essentially created this international framework through which to suspect Muslims, especially Muslims who are politically active in any way, and especially Muslims who are politically dissident in any way. And it then gave a carte blanche to the countries in Europe to repress and mistreat and discriminate against their Muslim refugees from Turkey, from Syria, from Yemen, from Afghanistan, because many of the refugees from the Middle East go to Europe because they can do so by crossing land. Whereas it's much easier to come to the US because you have to ride an airplane and the security measures stop you. Similarly, it gives a carte blanche to China, which has had a long-standing desire to quash and eliminate Muslim religion from the Uyghur population, which has its origins in, from the Turkish people. And Islam has been part of the Xinjiang province in northwestern China for generations. So now China is no longer standing out. They're saying, well, we think they're terrorists just like you think they're terrorists, even though there's no evidence that they're actually terrorists. But take that and then juxtapose it with something that's even worse that everybody's having to deal with, which is the rise of right-wing extremism and the far right, and which is a serious problem in Europe. And we saw is a serious problem here when on January 6, 2021, a group of far right-wing, all-white extremists attempted to stop the Democratic election of Joe Biden. And they did so by seizing the Capitol and engaging in all sorts of criminal acts. So right now we need to be, there's a lot that's going to happen in the future. And the question is going to be will Western governments take seriously the far right-wing threat? Or will they look at it as, oh, it's just a minor thing because these people share the same religious and racial identity as those in power? And then will they also stop suspecting Muslims all the time? Now with India, it's also very complicated because as we all know, Muslims are a large minority in India. And my understanding is they've reached about 14 million out of a population of over 1 billion. So and they are indigenous to the land. These are not people who, I understand that the separation, there was some forced migration, but this is a long-standing issue. So we do have to contextualize Islamophobia, but what's happening in India is not disconnected from the rise of the far right in India. So again, there's this very far right wing ideology that's taking over the politics of so many countries. And unfortunately, Muslims are the first targets and victims of their hateful ideology.
Yeah. All right. Sahar, thank you so much. We could go on with this conversation. It's really interesting. But for now, I'm just very grateful and thankful that you were able to take your time and come over here and have this fantastic and very sharp conversation. And I'll urge all my viewers to go get Sahar's book, The Racial Muslim. It's one of the sharpest books written on this subject. And again, many congratulations. And I'm so glad that we were finally able to have this conversation today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
And for those of you watching, thank you so much. I hope you will subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Spotify. Do stay tuned as we'll be coming with more such conversations. I'll see you again very soon.